Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. Hi, I'm Bob DELANEY, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Island families. This evening's edition will host Legislative Issues with Jim Parisi, where we bring the legislature into your living room. We hope you enjoy this edition of Legislative Issues and Labor Vision.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly right into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field representative with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I am your host this evening. This is the 2017 legislative session, and we thought it would be good to have a quick review of how things went for labor movement last year, as well as what is on labor's agenda this year. And I'm pleased to have in our studio today the president of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO, George Nee. George, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jimmy, and thank you for the great job you do running this show for many, many years.
We got a lot done last year, didn't we?
We had a very good year, but before I go into some of the specifics, I think sometimes it's important for our members and the people that we represent, and also the general public who benefits from a lot of the lobbying and a lot of the activities that we do, to sometimes look at the things that didn't happen, and as opposed to the things that did. We've been having efforts for the last several years to try to take away unemployment benefits from what we call seasonal or temporary workers. That never went anywhere. There's been efforts to try to weaken or dismantle the TDI system, which is so important to working people. That never went anywhere. An issue that has gone around for a long time, initiative, which would allow for the direct election or the direct issues to be brought to the public, which are then subject to all kinds of outside money coming in. That's never gone anywhere either. And last year, there's been efforts to unfairly get involved in regionalization and consolidation of services, which will affect our members and affect the public, and that doesn't go anywhere. So sometimes it's the things that don't happen that we have to at least remind people that we're still ever vigilant on those things. Let me go through a couple of things that of importance for last year. Again, something that has been taken for granted over the last 5 or 6 years is an increase in the educational funding formula. That was, I think, about $35 million that went into the schools. This is all part of a process which I think ends fairly soon when they redid the funding formula.
Yeah, we have one more year of big increases.
On that. Mm-hmm. But in addition to that, there was some significant changes, not far enough from our perspective, in adjustments to the funding formula to deal with the issue of some of the schools that are dealing with a lot of people, with a lot of students with issues that cost more money. Also, the fact that the mayoral academies in particular don't pay into the pension system, so that's finally starting to be recognized a little bit. Also, although I would argue it hadn't been used, it wasn't used properly in the most recent expansion approval by the Rhode Island Board of Education, they are supposed to now take into account local approval and also the impact on the school system of any new mayoral academies and charter schools. And I think Representative O'Grady, who had been a champion on that issue, even came and testified at that hearing that the RIDE, when they were making their decision, didn't implement that properly. So maybe there'll be some repercussions from that, hopefully, and they'll tighten that language up a little bit. We also were successful with getting into the budget and supporting an increase in the Earned Income Tax Credit, which benefits a lot of low-income working people.
I think that's an example of so many things that the labor movement works on aren't just for our members.
Exactly.
But they're for the general public. The education issues, in this case, the Earned Income Tax Credit. We probably have some, but not many union members, but that's an important issue for the labor movement.
It's the right issue because it's creating a just society, and it's good public policy. And I've stated before, and I firmly believe this, that we are the people's lobby. A lot of things that we do, whether it's fighting for the minimum wage, education, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation. They benefit all working people, not just union members. So if we're not there fighting on these issues, who would be? And we're really the force that makes that happen. So I think that's a good point. We also were successful in an issue that continues to haunt our society is wage theft. We should call it what it is. These are situations where employers cheat workers. Either they cheat them on their overtime, they don't pay the minimum wage, they don't pay them for the hours they work. So they're stealing from workers. And in that situation, we've been seeking ways to get stronger enforcement. Last year, thanks to Representative Sakachi, who is our new majority leader, and Senator Nesselbush, there's now a new enforcement mechanism where if an employer is charged with not paying the workers and doesn't pay, they can go after their license to do business. So that's adding another enforcement tool to make sure workers are treated properly. We also, early in the session, were successful in getting the General Assembly to put the Tiverton Casino on the ballot, and that happened, and it was passed, in addition to several other bond issues, all of which were supported by the labor movement and all passed, which will make our economy stronger. We supported roadworks, and I think people are seeing already what roadworks is doing. There are bridges being fixed, workers are working, things are going to be safer. And tremendous credit to the governor and the leaders of the General Assembly, Speaker Mattiello and Senate President Paiva-Weed, for taking leadership and putting up with a lot of nonsense and a lot of false information, but standing for the people in this situation. And that is going to make a big difference.
I think every Rhode Islander knows our roads and bridges needed fixing, and we can have disagreements on how to pay for it, but I certainly like the mechanism that the Assembly came up with, and the way they did it, we're able to see some action now instead of waiting a few years before some of these renovations.
Major funding for the developmentally disabled community, which is, again, not properly funded, but we're making progress in that area. And also some increased funding for the nursing home industry and our members that work in those nursing homes. And a very controversial issue that we opposed, and we were successful, was an issue that would have provided for a local referendum for the approval of any economic development project in a lot of cities and towns. There is a public purpose in a lot of these things. There's a state value. And if you allow cities and towns to have veto power over that, it could really hinder economic development going forward. So those were all good things that we did. Now, we had a few disappointments. We were unsuccessful for the first time in 4 years in getting an increase in the minimum wage. Our minimum wage last was 16, went up to $9.60. We were hoping to continue the trend of getting an increase.
And our neighbors are increasing theirs.
Our neighbors are increasing it substantially. Massachusetts went to $11 on January 1st, and Connecticut went to $10.10. So now, think about it. You have a Rhode Island worker working at a fast food place or a retail store or some of the other very profitable companies that are paying the minimum wage. That worker in Massachusetts is now making $1.40 more per hour than the worker in Rhode Island doing the same job. Now, I would maintain, if you go to McDonald's, the hamburger in McDonald's in Rhode Island is going to cost the same as the one in Massachusetts. And the worker's going to make $1.40 an hour less in some of these industries. And and I don't like to be pessimistic, but given our new president and given our new Congress, I don't think the federal minimum wage is going to go up this year. And that's been stuck at $7.25 for almost 10 years now.
It's shockingly low compared to what many other states have done because of federal inaction.
Right. It's a matter of equity and fairness, and that was very disappointing. We also were unsuccessful in getting an increase in the maximum benefit for unemployment insurance, even though the employers did get a tax break this year. But we felt that if business was going to get a tax break, then we should make some adjustments on the benefit side that have been held up for quite a long time. So that was disappointing. Then, of course, our Institute for Labor Studies and Research got caught up in the whole mess with the community service grants, and we ended up losing that grant. But we're still in business and we're doing well.
We are. We are survivors, aren't we, George?
So we are survivors. Well, the Institute's been around for 35 years, I think 36 years now, so I guess we've gone through some ups and downs, so we'll prevail. So I think that's a kind of a pretty good snapshot, actually more than a snapshot, it might be a whole movie of what happened last year. And again, as you said, in a lot of areas, this was an extremely good year. And we thank our members for being active in it, and we also thank the leaders and members of the General Assembly that supported these issues, because I think they are helping to make this a better state.
So the year has begun, and the General Assembly is just starting its work. They convened the first Tuesday of January, and they're back in session. So what does labor's agenda look like this year? What are some of the key priorities for the labor movement in 2017? Well,
in addition to continuing to defend and make sure that some of the things that we are opposed to don't go anywhere, which is always part of our package. We will be seeking a significant increase in the minimum wage. Both Senator Lynch and Representative Bennett, who have been the champions on this issue by sponsoring the legislation over the last 4 or 5 years, are both going to be introducing legislation that would raise the minimum wage in Rhode Island to $10.50 on July 1st of 2017.
So what else is on the list?
Well, we'll also be looking to get some increases in the unemployment benefits, particularly the maximum benefits. What happens is there's a cap on the maximum benefit. And as a result of that, the percentage of your replacement income isn't as great when you're at the maximum benefit. So for nurses, teachers, construction workers, other higher, telephone workers, other people on the higher end, which we hope to represent and move people into that area, when they get unemployed, they get a less percentage of their income replaced than you do at that level. So that's something we think is fair. We will be making a concerted effort to make sure that the mayoral academies, which are a different breed than the charter schools. They're kind of like charter schools on steroids. They created some exemption, like somehow or another mayors know a lot about education. I mean, I'm sure some do, but I don't think that's an ideal that they all are experts in education. But they created this entity called mayoral academies, and they don't pay into the pension system, unlike other charter schools and the other public schools, obviously. And they're not subject to the prevailing wage laws. So they're using public dollars. They're expending those dollars, and then they get a free ride. They don't have to pay community standard wages on construction projects, and they don't pay into the pension system, or they don't even have to pay the prevailing wage rate for teachers.
That's probably why Achievement First was able to send so much of their money to the corporate office outside of the state of Rhode Island.
So we're giving them money. They're sending it over down the street, and they're not paying their full fair share to the workers on the pension system. So as a result of that, they're getting that extra money. If we're going to compare scores, et cetera, let's have apples and apples and oranges, not the way that we're doing it right now. They have let's just level the playing field and everybody plays by that standard. We will also be supporting, again, an increase in the earned income tax credit. And hopefully the governor next week in her budget will have that in there. And also, let me have one other thing. Oh, we've got a little campaign going on to fix our schools. Our schools are in deplorable shape, terrible shape.
You're talking about the buildings themselves.
The buildings themselves, correct. And there are all kinds of estimates of what it would cost to get our schools up to the kind of standards where a student or a parent walks in and looks at a building and says, hey, somebody really cares about me. This is a nice place to learn. We have some schools that are terrific. Newly built, the new Pell School down in Newport is an example of that. We have some schools that have been rehabbed. We have some schools that, unfortunately, every month or every 3 months or 6 months, Band-Aid after Band-Aid after Band-Aid, which in the long run costs more money than it does to fix it right. So a interesting coalition of a lot of different groups, the labor movement, the teacher unions, a number of other health organizations. If we're going to send a message to children that education is important, you can't do it when they go to a school that's fallen down around them. They're not stupid. These kids are smart. And they say, wait a minute, you don't really mean what you're saying. Mm-hmm. It's, so that's going to be an effort. We're looking at all kinds of funding streams. We're looking at, just recently, 7 communities were successful in getting bond issues passed, which were supported by labor. And we need to do that, we need to do bond issues, but we can't wait 2 more years for a general election. We need to find funding streams, and whether it's energy efficiencies issues that National Grid has a great program with. So we've got the Infrastructure Bank, which was just renamed from the Clean Water Financing, has some ideas for that. So we've got some ideas on that of different ways, but that's something that has to be done, right away.
And it'd be a great opportunity to modernize schools so that they can utilize to the fullest extent possible new technology that is so important in our classrooms.
Exactly. Every school should have all of that top-notch stuff if we want kids to learn, because that's the world they're going to live in. Yeah. We will be again pushing for increased funding for the nursing homes and the people in the developmentally disabled community that work there. Their wages are still far behind. They should get the $15 tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Forget about this incremental stuff. Tomorrow. And then they should get some retroactive money for the years that they've been underpaid. And I'd like to see some effort this year to increase the temporary caregiver program, mm-hmm. which is run by TDI from the 4 weeks to 8 weeks, because that program has been extremely successful. All of the concerns that people raised didn't materialize, and it benefits men, women, and children. So how could you be against that one?
No one should be against that one, George. Well, as expected, that's quite an ambitious agenda. Again, touching a lot of different aspects of workers' lives that you've got on your plate this year. I wish you luck. We are going to bring in other labor leaders to talk about their specific unions' legislative agendas. And this year we look forward to bringing in even more elected officials, both senators and representatives, to talk specifically about legislation they're working along the lines of what you've just outlined for us.
Terrific.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision.
In October of 1929, the stock market in the United States crashed. The causes are complicated and still controversial, but the widespread practice of borrowing money from banks for speculation in the market was certainly a factor. Between early October and early November, the stock market lost over 40% of its value. A wave of confusion and fear led people to withdraw their money from banks, and this in turn caused nearly 6,000 banks to fail. The subsequent contraction of credit led to businesses failing and loss of employment. Rising unemployment meant less spending and more layoffs, and the situation snowballed into the most severe economic downturn in American history. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 raised tariffs on imports and led other countries to retaliate. Trade between the U.S. and other countries fell by over 50%. Agricultural exports dropped drastically, and the ensuing fall in prices led to many farmers abandoning production and even leaving their farms. Entire families became migrants looking for work wherever they could find it. The unemployment rate approached 25%, and millions more were only marginally employed. There was, of course, no unemployment compensation at this time. During the 1932 presidential election campaign, Franklin Roosevelt promised to change things. He differed from incumbent President Herbert Hoover in that he did not believe action should be controlled by an ideology of limited government. He won 57% of the vote and carried all but 6 states. He immediately began his New Deal for the American people. Roosevelt started by reopening many banks under government supervision. The public reacted favorably, and deposits began to flow back into the banking system. The Glass-Steagall Act was passed to regulate banking speculation and established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to insure deposits, thus stopping runs on banks by nervous depositors. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created to employ young men to plant trees, fight erosion, and build roads in rural areas. The National Industrial Recovery Act authorized the regulation of production in order to raise prices and gave unions the right to organize without coercion by owners. Other programs funded both private contractors and public projects to employ workers building roads, bridges, hospitals, schools, and dams. The National Recovery Administration brought labor and industry together in an effort to set minimum wages and prices in order to stabilize markets. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration was launched to increase commodity prices by compensating farmers for reducing production. Roosevelt used radio broadcasts to address the nation in what became known as fireside chats. And although the New Deal was not successful on all fronts, things did get better. Industrial production was up by 55% by 1935, and 4 million more workers were employed by that year compared to the low point of 1933. The price of agricultural products recovered enough so that farming was viable again. In addition to President Roosevelt, labor unions had two other powerful allies during the 1930s. Both were women. Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, personally attended labor meetings and earned great respect for her willingness to enter even the dirtiest and most dangerous of workplaces. President Roosevelt appointed Frances Perkins to be Secretary of Labor. She was the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the U.S. government. Throughout her career, she was a staunch supporter of labor unions. The National Labor Relations Act of 1935 guaranteed the right to organize unions, to bargain collectively, and to strike. It created the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, to oversee union representation elections and to prosecute violations of the Act. After long years of struggle, labor unions finally had some legal protections needed to stand up to management and to organize. The impact was huge. This act eliminated many legal obstructions to union organization, such as injunctions, and put in place significant barriers to employer interference with union activities. The Social Security Act also passed in 1935. It was a landmark achievement that provided a basic level of support for working people in their later years. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 established a minimum wage, maximum hours, overtime pay, and prohibitions on most forms of child labor. It took over a century, but the horrible practice of using children in the industrial workplace was finally banned. In a few short years, labor had gone from near bankruptcy to a position of near equal footing with the companies they had struggled with for so long. Roosevelt's efforts on labor's behalf won him huge popularity among working people. The 1930s did have its share of strikes and sometimes violent actions around union organizing. During the Minneapolis trucker strike of 1934, pitched battles were waged in the streets between the striking Teamsters and police supported by a local business militia. Several deaths occurred on both sides before a federal mediator was able to obtain a settlement that won the Teamsters' primary demands, including recognition of the union. This trucker strike turned into a citywide general strike. Similar citywide strikes also occurred that year in San Francisco and Toledo. The AFL's policy of organizing only skilled workers, known as craft unionism, left out the vast majority of working people. During the 1930s, the AFL was urged to change this approach, but the conservative leaders did little to alter their strategies. Shortly after an open dispute at the AFL convention in 1935, John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers joined with other disaffected leaders to form the CIO, the Committee of Industrial Organizations. A few years later, the CIO broke away from the AFL, became the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and grew rapidly by organizing unions in steel, rubber, glass, electronics, autos, and many other industries. The AFL responded by vigorously increasing its organizing efforts, and the competition led to enormous growth for both groups. At the end of 1937, the AFL claimed 3,400,000 members, and the CIO 3,700,000 members. An episode during the Republic Steel Strike in 1937 shows that violence against working people was not over yet, even with a labor-friendly administration in Washington. During a peaceful march of Union sympathizers carrying the American flag, Chicago police fired on the crowd and continued firing as people fled. 10 marchers were killed and dozens wounded. Many were clubbed by the police and suffered head injuries. Although photographs showed the violent beatings, none of the police were charged with any wrongdoing. In its efforts to unionize the auto industry, a new tactic was employed by the United Automobile Workers at the General Motors body plant in Flint, Michigan. The union occupied the plant in what was called a sit-down strike. This meant taking control of the facility and keeping management and potential replacement workers out. A local judge did issue an injunction against the union, but the Michigan governor and the Roosevelt administration were sympathetic to the union, and no action was taken to remove the strikers. The governor served as an intermediary between the company and the union, and John Lewis of the CIO helped with negotiations. In February of 1937, GM signed an agreement recognizing the union. This victory for the UAW and the CIO eventually led to the unionization of the entire auto industry, and the UAW quickly grew to include 500,000 members. The steel industry had resisted union organization for decades, but after seeing that government was no longer going to back management, the head of U.S. Steel decided to avoid a costly battle. Just 3 weeks after the UAW General Motors settlement, U.S. Steel signed an agreement and recognized the Steelworkers Organizing Committee as the bargaining agent for its workers. Within just a few months, many other steel companies followed, and by the end of the year, the union claimed over 300,000 members. Roosevelt's relief efforts did reduce the suffering of the American people, but the impact of the Depression lingered until the start of World War II. It is generally agreed that massive government spending by many nations on war materials led to higher employment levels and general economic recovery. With so many men mobilized for war, unemployment in the U.S. dropped from a high of almost 25% in 1933 to under 2% in 1943. During World War II, business and labor generally cooperated and both profited.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.